We got Claire Crawford on the line talking Ohio State football. Join her and Joe Dexter for Oh Hail No. That's their podcast you can find on theozone.net. We got our wins. We got our losses. Who's coaching your team for Ohio State? Who's the guy?
So this is a tough one. And if you're an Ohio State fan, you'll know who Jack Park is. And Jack Park is an Ohio State historian. For those of you who aren't Ohio State fans, and he's one of my favorite people walking this planet. I'm debating on whether to go with the really easy pick or if I go with a Jack Park pick. I'm
asking for a Claire Crawford pick.
I know. I'm honestly tempted. Well, it's difficult because if we're coaching a modern football team, I wouldn't necessarily pick a Wes Fessler, but I'm also tempted to pick a really old school Wes Fessler who created lots of amazing traditions at Ohio State, was an extremely winning coach as far as his percentages, but obviously is not necessarily going to be able to coach like the forward pass.
So I take this as your favorite coach. This doesn't have to be the best coach. Your favorite.
Well, you've got to go with Woody. And not taking anything away from Urban. I think Woody Hayes and knowing what he did for the community, there's a story that I love about Woody Hayes. And I know you have a lot of Clemson fans on here, so they're just going to absolutely murder me for mentioning Woody Hayes, but there's a good reason. Woody used to go to speaking engagements, and they would pay him to do so, and it was still in the days of someone writing you a check for it, and he would put them in his pocket and never cash them. And his wife Anne would find these checks, and she knew better than to even take them to the bank. Is that he wouldn't want her to do that. The things that he did for his players, very quietly, the community that he built, the traditions that he built at Ohio State, his passion for the rivalry is something that is probably going to make him jump above all other coaches in my mind. I obviously am a huge fan of the game, and no one is going to be able to convince me otherwise that isn't the greatest rivalry in sports. And Woody and Bo and the 10-year war, there still isn't anything that compares to that. And Woody went out of his way to do things. And you and I have talked about the rug that they used to have to walk over every single day as a reminder. Woody Hayes wouldn't, they ran out of gas in Michigan and had to roll the car the bus across state lines because he refused to pay, give any taxes to that state up north. He had a lot of respect for Bo. They were very good friends. They obviously used to coach together at Ohio State. Him being from Miami, saying that that's the cradle of coaches. So many amazing coaches came from that area. And he is the cream of the crop. So he was passionate, and yes, he had a temper that ultimately ended his career. But I definitely think that Woody was meant to be born in the era he was born in. And we're thankful he was.
A truer statement has never been uttered. Yes, Woody Hayes in 2018 would have been that would have been a train wreck, but it would have been just priceless.
Violation after violation after violation, I'm sure.
Yeah, in 2018, I think we need to put those days into context, understanding that these grew up at a different time in our history, whether it's Woody Hayes, Bo Schembechler, Bobby Knight, those guys, when it came down to it and their players would vouch for them, those guys had a heart of gold.
Yes.
and would do anything for charity, would do anything for their teammates, and then later their players. And the stories, when it comes down to it, and their actions spoke louder than maybe their actions on a field or a court, of how they conducted themselves and the character that they had. Yes, they grew up at a different time. So grabbing players by face masks or shoving guys around or doing whatever they had to do, they were men's men, and that's how they grew up.
And you can't deny his resume at Ohio State and how many national championships he was able to bring. And obviously, lots and lots is named after him at Ohio State. There's a very big statue right outside the Woody Hayes where Urban Meyer and his teams work out and practice and play every day. And there's definitely a reason for it.
So a lot of people would go, a lot of people would go to the John Cooper era, because John Cooper has a fascinating run at Ohio State. So for Buckeye fans, it's not fascinating. But to me, trying to be an unbiased college football observer, it's fascinating from the standpoint, if you tack 2 or 3 wins onto John Cooper's resume at Ohio State, the narrative completely changes. He's got a completely different career.
I would say those wins would have to be bowl wins in order for that to be the case.
Or Michigan games.
Or Michigan games.
Exactly. So in 93, 95, 96. So there's 3 seasons right there in the span of 4 years. They're undefeated playing Michigan, and they lose. And they're playing for a national title if they beat Michigan. But they didn't. And you referenced the Nick Saban Michigan State team that beat Ohio State in 98. That then, of course, since they had the loss and were kind of knocked out of it, of course, they complete the run and beat Michigan and win the Rose Bowl, but they had lost earlier. So that's why John Cooper, his record is not bad. And he had about 4 or 5 exceptional teams that were as good as anyone in the country, but he lost the wrong games.
And I think a lot of people point to John Cooper and say, oh, he was a great recruiter of talent, which you can't deny that. You see the guys that, Orlando Pace and Eddie George, the guys that we can point to, David Boston. That list is very, very long. And even some people will argue that Trestle's 2002 team would have been partially John Cooper's recruits as well. So, I mean, it's you can't deny that about him. And I think the John Cooper apologists will use that as their brandishing stick to say this is, but he did do this. Ultimately, when it comes down to Ohio State, there are a few things that count the most, and beating Michigan is on the top of that list.
Yeah, for John Cooper, the crescendo was winning the Rose Bowl over Arizona State, coming back to win that game, finishing 11-1. And then, I'm sorry?
It wasn't Jake the Snake, right?
Jake the Snake, who thought he scored the game-winning touchdown. But, of course, David Boston and Joe Germain had other ideas.
Gosh.
And then 2 years later, they beat Michigan and beat Texas A&M, a top 5 team that won the Big 12 in the Sugar Bowl. And they finished number 2 again. So that was 2 number 2 finishes in the span of 3 years for John Cooper. What might have been.
And that would have been pre-BCS, right?
So I've got a story for you. 1998, I'm at the Georgia Dome for the SEC championship game, covering the SEC championship game, Tennessee and Mississippi State. Tennessee's number 1. During the course of that day, Ohio State was like number 5, number 6, something like that in the nation. And there were just a line of 1-loss teams, and Tennessee was the one undefeated team. So during the course of the day, I'm sorry, what?
Was that Peyton's senior year, or was he 96?
No, he was gone. So it was T. Martin.
T. Martin.
And that's the interesting oddity to Tennessee football, is that Peyton Manning's the golden child and won the Heisman, or he almost won the Heisman, lost the Heisman to Charles Woodson. Everybody thought he was going to win the Heisman. And then, of course, he becomes one of the great NFL quarterbacks in history. But he left Tennessee, and then they won the national championship the next year. But I'm at the Georgia Dome earlier in the day. So this is the last game of the day. Earlier in the day, UCLA was in front of Ohio State. They lost. Kansas State was in front of Ohio State. They lost the Big 12 championship game. And one other shoe had to fall, and that had to be Tennessee. And Tennessee was down in the fourth quarter of the SEC championship game to Mississippi State, but they came back and they won the game with 2 touchdowns in the last 10 minutes of the game. And Ohio State then went to the Sugar Bowl. And so it was a BCS championship game between Tennessee and Florida State, the very first one.